Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
And welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Alvaro Munoz from GitHub about open source security. I'm John Kinsella. I'm here with Lee Neely, and it's time for the news. First, we'll go through in one or two announcements. So first, don't miss any of our favorite Security Weekly content, or even yours as well. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to our podcast feeds and to have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing lists, join our Discord server. We're also on Twitch now, YouTube. Follow us on social media and all our streaming platforms. Join us April 14th to learn about how to monitor for your Wi-Fi network for attacks on Enzyme, a free and open source wireless intrusion detection system with Leonard Kopin, hosted by Larry Pitch and Paul Asdorian. Then join Alan Sukakis and host Tyler Robertson and Paul Asdorian April 21st to learn how to gain visibility into your enterprise with Sysmon. Live attendees at both these webcasts will have the chance to win a $100 Hacker Warehouse gift card and register at securityweekly.com/webcasts. Don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at security.weekly/on-demand. So Lee, got a bunch of news stories here. Hope some of these are going to capture your eye. Again, appreciate you filling in. And let's see, where do we want to dig in first?
The Salon of Vulnerability, your very first story.
Yes.
I was looking at that, and I read it, and I said, no. And I read it again, and I'm like, that's, holy moly, that's like, they forgot that true and true is also true. False and false is also true. That feels like they forgot shortcut logic or something. It stopped parsing.
We've been having, for the last few weeks, we've been talking about vulnerabilities in some of these cryptocurrencies, and sort of using this as an example. I'm not here to bash, but really from my point of view, the point we're trying to get across is these are now it's become an industry, right? There's billions, if not trillions of US dollars worth of currency being moved through these things. But yet, while if you look at a bank of the same age or a fintech, most fintech startups of the same age, the security is a lot better than what we're seeing in a lot of these coins. So this first article here, for our listeners, what we decided to do, or what I found, is someone took a vulnerability that was found in Solana, which resulted in 98,000 Ethereums, which multiplied that by $2,300 US, and that'll give you an approximate value, a large amount of money, were stolen. But this particular post, they went through and they said, hey, here's the ELI 5. Explain it to me like I'm 5 years old. What actually happened here? Because frequently when we look at these, Lee, they're very complex, and it's like, you start feeling like you're speaking another language, like, some sort of special transaction happens and then it's on a certain thing and blah, 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 blah. So that's what I really liked about this. As you said, it's a logic error, right? It's, let's see here. The logic that they wrote was, is there a valid signature on the request? Did it come from a guardian? And did it come from a guardian? So if both of those are true, right, that's what you want, and their request gets approved. But if one of those is true and one of those is false, the request gets denied, which is okay. So far, so good. But if you have neither a valid signature and you're not coming from a guardian account, that's, as you said, this and this, right? And go get it wrong myself. That's also true, and that resulted in someone having a pretty nice payday.
Yeah, and the reason I'm paying attention a bit more to crypto these days is because it's getting mainstream. I mean, your credit unions have crypto offerings. Your online payments. Everybody's getting into it. It's not so esoteric anymore. And I'm kind of surprised. I think, like you, as you're saying, a financial institute of similar age would not be making these kinds of errors. And so I'm a little concerned because now we're getting the less skilled investors in there, and I'm worried they're gonna get in trouble.
And I mean, it's you're right. It's not just all those organizations you mentioned. But we actually have countries now that are starting to do crypto-based currencies, they're actually officially being supported by the government. So if you're going to go in, I'm not sure which coins these guys are using because I really don't watch this stuff too closely. But suddenly you've got a part of your country's your currency literally is being based off something that's I don't want to say amazingly buggy, but we have stories like this. This is probably the third one like this we've covered this year. So it's not a really good look.
No, we're not going to tell Grandma to go invest in crypto while this is still kind of going on.
No, not at all. Well, let me keep going. We've got some interesting stories to cover here, so we'll try to get through most of these. We'll see how we do time-wise.
Let's do it.
OpenSSL. I think, speaking of something which has vulnerabilities occasionally, was recently updated after they found a high severity denial of service in one of their encryption libraries. And this was sort of interesting. I think we've got a few stories here. If I was Mike, I'd pull this team together a little bit closer. But we've got a few stories of as functionality was added into a product. And again, this is sort of like, Alvaro was talking about last hour with JNDI and Log4j. Frequently, when we start adding functionality into something to, increase the feature set, we might have been really great about our security first time and had a nice, tight little package. But, excuse me, the more you add, things sort of get out of hand. And in this particular case, were adding support for elliptic curves. And someone said, hey, we want to be able to have elliptic curves of varying key lengths. And the result of that, adding that functionality was they've got a modulus square root function, which you could then be able to craft a invalid key and supply it to it, and you'd end up in a DOS situation.
It's actually kind of a cool exploit. But what I'm laughing over here is I remember I did at one point do some programming, and some of the programming errors I made were horrific. Things like infinite recursion and other things that I just didn't know enough not to do. But I keep thinking, code like this, these guys got to be at least 10 times smarter than me, but I guess they're still human, right?
Yeah, it always comes back to these. You could probably make a parallel between this and our previous story, and in a way, it's some sort of a logic issue. I'm sure it's a little more probably checking bounds on that. I didn't look at the actual code behind it itself, but yeah, it's when I first got to college, we weren't accidentally making DOS errors. We were on shared Unix systems, so it became sort of a bit of a game for us. Let's see if we can go and DOS everyone else off the box by going and running some for loop and hopefully not getting caught. But those were back in my slightly more malicious days. I would never do something like that nowadays.
Well, just say I did it accidentally with write recursion in Prolog, where I would actually just eat up all the memory on the shared Unix machine without even realizing it. It was kind of bad for the other users. Even the sysadmin had a hard time getting in there to get things fixed.
Oh yeah,
I didn't realize.
It's funny because we're acting like the old timers here and talking about things from the past. And yeah, you might think funny, haha. And on a shared system, it becomes very, very easy in some cases to end up in a situation like this, right? And it's either if it's funny, haha, or you're malicious. Unfortunately, frequently back in those days, you'd have to either go to a console and if you're lucky, get a response back from there, because frequently you would, when you do these DOS attacks, you're actually also killing the network, even if it wasn't a network attack. So you'd have to somehow go and trundle from your desk off into a server room somewhere, find the right server, get a console on it, and try to log in and be very patient to make sure your password gets taken before it times out, and actually try and kill that guy. And if that doesn't work, at some point you're just pressing the button, right, to bounce the thing and actually bring it back up. So I'm going to use that little analogy to move over to another story, talking about CrowdStrike found something called Crate Escape. So lately, I'm not sure how up to date you are on Kubernetes, and saying you're not is perfectly fine in my book. While I'm still involved in those scenes right now, I'm quite happy to say I'm not running Kubernetes, because this stuff, we're getting more and more complex with each one of these stories, and it's not purposeful. But yeah, I don't know if you read this story, if you had any thoughts on it.
Well, like I'm not super up on Kubernetes. I've got a series of friends who really do know. They don't only know how to do Kubernetes. They play it on TV. You know, they're the pros I call. And when I'd seen this before, and it was like, oh, hey, wait a minute. But isn't this one where you have to be running a privileged container, though, which is kind of a no-no? Is this the one? I'm catching my brain up. I'm not. It's
No, that's quite all right, and I'm throwing you on the spot. And it's actually a good question to me, even though I came up when I found the story. So what is going on here is, so Create Escape is, there are nowadays 2 container runtimes which are used by Kubernetes, or OpenShift or some of these other orchestration platforms. It used to just be Docker, and then this thing called CRI-O came along from, I believe, Red Hat. And in this particular case, someone decided that, again, we're back to adding features. So someone said, hey, we'd really love when we're starting a container to be able to run some system sysctl commands. So we'd want to be able to, oh man, I can't give you a good example. Let's see. Maybe we'd want to change our file system buffer size, or I'm sure they had some sort of good thoughts in their mind of why you'd want to run sysctl. But unfortunately, when this was implemented, they didn't put any validations on this. So you can submit, when you're doing that pod container specification, you can put any sort of string of sysctl in there. And what the guys did, yeah. So,
well, I think about, yeah.
Go ahead.
One of the common things I've had to add to kernels when they're starting is semaphores and messaging and other blocks related to doing a database or an LDAP server. You need to increase those parameters off the defaults. And you might want to do it at runtime so you haven't got a specific kernel. But this might not be a good model.
Yeah, and I mean that those are decent examples, and it's for folks who don't know. Sysctl, what it allows you to do is in both, in a Unix style kernel, you have what are called tunables. So those are like, basically you want to have how would I say, sane defaults for how big is your file buffer, how many files can be opened at the same time. As Lee was saying, how many semaphores are on the system. And usually those defaults are perfectly fine if you're running, some common things. If you're doing usually high performance things, like maybe say like a web server or a database, usually those defaults aren't high enough. And there's plenty of resources on your system, but if the tunable is set to a lower number, the resources are just sitting there and they're not being used. So yeah, maybe if you got like the ones I used to do were with web servers, you'd crank open the number of simultaneous TCP connections. So yeah, there's definitely valid uses for these things as my brain sort of, the caffeine's kicking in. But in this particular case, Lee, one of the proof of concept they came up with is one of those tunables is, what do you do when you've got a core dump on your system? So depending on the system you're on, there's different variables of how you want to think about doing this. So, core dump on a Unix system, you've got a process actually crashing. It's about to give up life. What do you do with it? Do you want to be able to debug that and figure out what happened? Do you, if you've got a process that's running, especially on imagine like a Unix system from even 10 years ago, if you've got a process which is running and taking up 10 gigabytes of memory, and it crashes, do you really want to write that memory footprint out to disk for debugging, or do you maybe want to not do that? So this is why this is a tunable. Or maybe what you might want to do, a little more sophisticated idea, would be to, hey, let's go ahead and run a debugger against that real quick and get a stack trace of what's going on or something. So what these guys came up with was, well, let's go ahead and create a pod container definition that will put a specification in there for a sysctl that when it crashes to run this command. Lee, you want to take a guess what user that command's going to be running as?
I think it's going to be running as a privileged user, say root.
You're correct. So at that point, you've just owned the box. And this is funny, right? We're actually going a little bit ahead of our sort of ongoing schedule here. I usually say I'm expecting to see a new breakout in containers about once a year. And I think we're on this is number 2, if not number 3 this year. This is still relatively new technology. And for those of us running in our own clusters or something like that, that's fine. But if you're a cloud provider or someone doing this as a shared service, like we were just talking about, DOSing the box, here you could be coming back and DOSing the box in a different form.
I mean, it's really kind of cool if you think about it. I mean, somebody, be able to do that. Sorry, I remember back in the old days when I, out of frustration, you didn't want core files. You made a directory called core in the working directory so that it wouldn't dump one there.
Yeah.
That's like 40 years ago. Wow, this is cool.
There's all sorts of, and it's sort of funny, right? There's all sorts of tricks about this type of stuff. The core files used to take up too much space when we'd have small disks, and like if your system's running out of memory back in those days, you'd go through and look for where the core files are and remove them. And they obviously had really good use. If you've got a production system going on and there's some sort of a tricky, very occasionally happening crash, and you might have your logging enabled, but still, like, what's actually going on? What are those particular situations to actually get in that? So there's definitely value use for it. But it's definitely one of those things also of something old which was valuable is coming back to bite us again. When Alvaro was talking the last hour, about this exact same type of thing, one of the thoughts which went through my head on a pen test gig I had at one point, I was in a restricted shell, and it wasn't like C shell, it was some sort of shell which you can only run specific commands. So it was a very sort of jail housed shell, so to speak, jail kit. But what I found was I could run VI, and once you're in VI, you can actually exec any command you want because you're not using standard shell. So that was my way of sort of breaking out of that. And this is sort of, you start with something which it sounds like a great idea, and there's all sorts of amazing people into Kubernetes projects. But at the end of the day, things become, as we gain complexity, as people have heard us say many times, you're running into issues.
So mundane question before we move on. It said that there's a patch. How big of a deal is it for somebody to patch their cluster?
Good question. As I just closed that tab. They've got
I timed it. I waited for you to close it.
They just did. There's 2 things you can do here. So there is a new version of CRIO which has support for this. I'm missing it down in here for it. It was actually before the POC. There we go. So there's 2 ways you can go through this. Ideally, you want to block a pod that has any sysctl in there, right? It's and they say specifically the feedback which CrowdStrike has is pretty good. So you want to specifically block a sysctl that has either a plus or an equal sign in it. So at that point, it's obviously you're trying to do some sort of assignment. So you still might want to allow through some forms of those tunables. I guess maybe Booleans, but is what they're suggesting. But then at least in their mind, the less ideal alternative would be to use something called pod security policies. I'm not quite sure why they thought those were, and you'd use the pod security policy to block all sysctls in general. I'm not quite sure why they thought that was less ideal. I would think it'd be more ideal. Pod security policies are just about to be replaced by a newer version in, I think, 1.22. So maybe that's what they were thinking of. But then, really underneath preferably is if you can patch CRIO. So the first two we could do quite easily. We could do it stately. We could put a pod security policy on that says, hey, no sysctl, and that would take care of the problem in a pinch. But otherwise, they're saying either downgrade to a previous version of CRIO or upgrade to the latest, which has been out, I believe, for about a week now. So not horrible to fix. But anyways, keeping going. Let's see, where do I want to go next? Peace, not war. So, Lee, I'm not really too concerned on any one individual's or any of our thoughts on if the war in Ukraine should be happening or if it's war or not. But there was a case here where we've seen this before, unfortunately, several times now. But in this case, a developer who was a package maintainer of a fairly well-known package in the Node.js world. Or I should say in the JavaScript world, something called Node IPC. which some of us can probably guess is IPC package per node, which is internet. Excuse me. Wow, I'm going to screw up my own line. It's a internal process communications package. So in other words, how do we do communications between multiple node packages? Excuse me, multiple node processes or threads.
Right.
And that's sort of the original intent for it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm going to say unfortunately, the person who came up with this package decided that they weren't too happy with some of the stuff going on in Ukraine, and they released a new version of it that both linked to other vulnerable software, known vulnerable software, as well as had a bit of code in there that if it saw you trying to run his software from within a few countries, which are either Russia or friendly with Russia right now, that he was going to fill up your files with an emoji character. That by itself is not great. Unfortunately, with the world we live in with Node.js packages, that package was being used by the Vue web front-end framework, which has become fairly popular over the last year or two. So that means that anyone who updated their Vue suddenly got this package, and if they were in Russia, or that was the intention, if they were in those particular countries, they were going to get bad things happening to their drive. What's your thoughts on that so far?
It seems like, it's like, well, actually, I was trying to discern, was this the legit packet maintainer, or did a contributor decide to just crap all over him with this crazy code?
This was legit package maintainer. His username alone sort of makes me think this wasn't the first time. His username is RIA Evangelist. So that alone sort of he's got I believe it's 20 or 30 other packages which are fairly well used. So it becomes a bit of a bigger problem. But keep going with your thought process.
Also, my thought was, if you've got what amounts to a package that you've kind of vetted, that you've been using this guy's, he's got multiple packages. My one thought is, if it was somebody jumping in on his code, that could be QA problem, making sure the legit code is released. But if it's the main maintainer going bad, that's a whole nother, much more I don't want to say sticky wicket to have to work. Because like I said, as somebody using his code, you're like, this guy should be good because we've been using his stuff all along. What the hell, right?
Yeah.
Your guard's down. How can you test for this stuff?
So according to Snick, he has over 40 other NPM packages with quote unquote hundreds of millions of downloads behind them. So this is someone who's put a bunch of code out there, which is really being used.
Right.
And I thought, so there's two things we've been talking through here. There's several. You touched on one of them. Was it a malicious third party? No, it was the guy himself. It'd be interesting to see if it's signed, but I presume it is. And he's admitted. It's not like he's saying it's not him. He's fully admitted, and he's trying to say like, well, look, it's open source. You could have seen what I'm doing if you don't want to run it. All sorts of covering his back. And it's like, dude, at the end of the day, you're screwing a lot of people. And unfortunately, one of the people he's claimed that he's screwing is a non-governmental organization in the U.S. which is actually trying to help out Ukrainians. They've got a website which is used based off Vue, which would allow people to file reports of war crimes. And while they backed that system up once a month, because usually it was very, very slowly used and wasn't getting a lot of stuff, and last month they've gotten 30,000 requests on that site. And then this little module hit, and they've now lost 30,000 reports of war crimes, or at least this is the claim. People are sort of, it's God knows if that's real or not. It sounds real to me, but that's one example.
Yeah.
And then the question though becomes, at least for me, is like, okay, so we covered the first case of it could be some malicious other party. There's ways we go around that. In this case, it's a maintainer himself. That's not great. Now it's a maintainer of, as we were just saying, 40 other packages. So this is someone who, he's being trusted by quite a few folks. And I think the question there to me is, one of the thoughts in my head this morning is, do we think about pulling his permission across all of those, or how do we respond to that as a, both an industry as well as a community?
And can we roll back to previous versions? Do we know what versions are still good, or
so
I even replace code with something else?
I believe he's actually marked the previous ones, both deprecated and removed source for them.
Of course he has.
Yeah. So, and this is all in this SNCC post. So, for folks who want to double check what I'm saying, it's I'm talking and scanning, and I don't want to make things sound worse than they are. But this is what we've seen so far from the guys. So it's yeah. How do you know this isn't going to happen in another package? That sounds a little fear mongering, but I think at this point, once he's done this once, I think that's a fairly decent concern. Yeah, I don't know, man. We've built. I really love the idea, and we talk about it again on an almost weekly basis. This idea of additive collaboration. Of you write something amazing, I want to use it. I go, thanks, Lee, and I put it in my code, and I hopefully buy you a beer.
Yeah.
But the question is, once we go down that path, how do we make sure we're stable and sane about it?
And how do you make sure you've got a sufficient code testing process to catch something like this? I mean, if you don't check these new functions, the updated version probably still does what it's supposed to do. It's just got added features now. I'm thinking that's we're getting down into the evil supply. What is it? Software bill of materials or software supply chain security, which is raising its head, taking us out of into a non-trivial space to talk about. But it's definitely something to show. I'm hoping our folks are reading this article and think about how they would apply it in their. What could they do in their environment to at least minimize the risk of something like this happening? We know there's no absolute.
Yeah, it's a pretty good read, this blog post, because they go through actually with timestamps of how this whole thing happened. So two thoughts there, Anya. One, you mentioned it is part of the SBOM is one of the things you got to think about for this. They've got a screenshot of where this actually fits in, sort of the dependency tree. And it's not too deep. Like, so you install Vue, the CLI, and then the CLI installs is dependent upon the CLI UI. And then that's dependent upon both that as well as CLI shared utilities are both dependent upon Node. So it's not something you're directly installing. And that's the core of the problem with this is you can do everything right yourself, but if someone else is importing something like this and they're not pinning the version themselves, that's where, as you said, we end up in a sticky wicket. And I was talking about this with my team. It's like, are we pinning everything in our Node packages? Or we're a TypeScript shop, but still, are we pinning everything? And like everyone agrees that that's a good idea for us to pin to versions and everything. But that means suddenly now we have to start doing some sort of package management or version management. Like, when do we know when to update? As you said, how do we test it? So it becomes this very complex situation quite quickly.
Yeah.
And the one other thought, well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The one other thought I had on here, and it's actually near the beginning on this, they've got a code sample of the diff. And you're reading through, and even if you don't have to know JavaScript or really any language looking at this, you've got, a var import. So you got a few variables being defined. Function gets defined, something about math round, a Boolean check for something if a number's greater than 1. And then you start getting these funny looking lines where they're, basically turning what is, if you look closer, Lee, is a base 64 string. And they're suddenly starting to add a bunch of base 64 strings together and do something with them. And I don't know about your background, but if I see base 64 really anywhere in code, I know someone's up to no good. But it's a good sign for folks to see. And here I'll give you a homework assignment, guys, is if you don't know how, figure out how it's your command line. And these are not, there's nothing malicious in these strings by themselves, but go to this blog post, figure out where the base 64 encoded strings are. And I know you can do it out of the box on a Mac. I think you might be able to do it on a Windows machine, but figure out how, or go to a website. How do you decode that base 64 to understand what does that string actually, what's in there? So I think that's sort of the homework project for people for today.
Yeah. About a third of the way down the article, they've got the base 64 strings for you to look at and play with.
And what's interesting is while the blog post does tell you what some of those mean, which, to shout out to Mike, we've got some // in here. It's his favorite vulnerability and weakness. But while they show some of those strings, they don't show all, like the good ones. So I think it's and I think they're doing it. I'm not sure if they're trying to sanitize or what, but it's so easy to decode that it's worth definitely going and grabbing one and actually seeing what it's like yourself. If you ever have to respond, at least you'll know how to do this. Because I'll guarantee you, at least any vulnerability I've seen on a PHP root shells and things like that, it's always base 64 encoded. So if you know how to decode those, that'll help immensely. And that skill set is also good if you're applying for offensive securities. Is it the OSCP? I think it is. When you apply, you have at one point during the challenge, you have to base 64 decode something. You have to know that's what it is. I'm going to keep going. So since we're talking about packages, let's talk about security for package maintainers. Lee, I'm guessing you've done some Python. And this was an interesting article. I was hoping you would cover more than just Python when I started reading, but still at the same time, I think the ideas in here are good for really any of us. And this is being maintained. Excuse me. This is being focused on package maintainers, right? If you have something out there in public domain, how do you make sure that the first use case from our last story isn't what's going on of someone being able to maliciously manipulate something which you yourself are supposedly maintaining? So I thought this is a good list of things for people to think about.
Oh yeah, I mean this is I mean I'm not just now looking at it, but I'm looking at the things he's talking about. Those are, we've been preaching to the choir on this for a little bit. Including they were smart enough to say, hey, don't use SMS for two-factor, which I don't know how many times I've told people don't do that. These should be basics for everybody, but if you're not sure, this is a good place to start reading, because I like places where somebody consolidates it so you don't listen to 7 different sources to try and build a plan.
Exactly,
because you get these loose pieces. This pulls it all together very nicely, and it's understandable. No, they're not using $50 words here, and they got pictures that map your privileges and priorities and things so that you can understand it and you can pass it on. I don't know if I'd say it's a point where I could give it to senior management, but I could definitely give it to most folks I know. But yeah, and start at the top and work your way down. I mean, look at it. Don't ignore it.
Yeah, I was going to say it doesn't have nearly enough pretty pictures to give this to senior management. But as you scroll down a little bit further in the article, there is actually some pictures. I'll let you decide if they're pretty or not. But around that SMS example you mentioned, what I like about it also is he's not just saying don't do this, but he's saying this is why. So he's got 3-4 small paragraphs, but this is what's bad about SMS 2FA, SIM jacking and convenience and things like this we've talked about. But that's what I sort of liked about it is it's consultative. It's not just here's your top 10 things to do. There's pretty good reasoning behind it.
And it's not super sophisticated, hard to retain explanations. It's the basic. It's the easy answer. You're not struggling to understand what he means. It's like, oh, well, duh. Well, until you have that duh moment, it's not real. So kudos to him for writing it in a totally understandable way.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's it's sort of very little of what we're doing here is super complex, right? Or it shouldn't be. Let me put it that way. When we start talking about the crypto stuff, usually you'll see my eyes glaze over and Mike gets sort of, I don't want to say excited, but a little more animated. So for me, that's where things get a little more complex, and my eyes glaze over because you're spot on. I want the easy version. I don't want to have to go in every time and figure out, okay, how many bits should my key be and which algorithm should I be using, and is that algorithm still safe, and all these type of things. I want the easy button for that type of thing. And this, I think this blog post is a pretty good easy button or it shows us where the easy buttons are for a lot of this stuff, for probably not just maintainers. I'm going to wrap up with one more article, which I thought was sort of fun. And it's actually from 2017. It just popped back on my radar thanks to TLDR Sec last week. And this is about hopefully your favorite tool, but definitely mine, Burp Suite. And you know, how to burp good, sort of, you know, a little bit of a catchy title. But for me, I use Burp Suite in a very particular way, right? I'm almost always, I'm going to set up a proxy. I'm going to set up the burp to actually intercept everything. I'm going to filter down my target, what I'm looking for, figure out the fields I'm looking for, and then start doing manipulation. I've got a very sort of particular way that I use it, and a repeatable way for me at least. But there's a ton of stuff, and like those guys keep adding more and more great stuff to Burp. So even though this article is 5 years old, I think it gives, at least for me, and I mean, I knew of these things, but I think it gives people a reminder of there's a lot more you can do with this tool than just the basic proxy manipulation.
I haven't played with Burp as much as I'd like to, but every time I've used it, it's been an incredible. You forget what's going on in the covers and that it can be manipulated at other ends until you actually sit there and change things on the fly or see why something is so trivial to see when you're in line. Because like I said, it's easy to step back and say, well, nobody could possibly. Oh, yes, they can. Don't rely on the thing on the user's desktop to be secure. You don't know what it is. Like I said, but we've done some password spraying and other manipulations. Obviously, SSL stripping kinds of things. There are limits, though. I mean, if you get in line with certificate authentication, you're going to break it. But there isn't that much of that around. You could really you could do a lot of research with this sucker. My pen test team uses the professional licensed Burp, so they don't have to run into the limitations. I think there are some things that slow down if you're using the open source. If I remember right, they swear by it, not at it, by it.
It's a great tool, but like I think what's interesting there about what you said is it's sometimes we want the very atomic units of our tools to be able to do specifically what we're looking for. But what I think, at least for me, what's great about Burp with that example you mentioned, like password spray, is instead of me going to have to get all these individual pieces and glue them together and get them to work, I just click, set up, go, bang, and just off it goes. And often that's very useful. Get one last thought on there is, back to you're talking about executives. I don't know if your team ever does this with you, but if folks out there ever want to, either encourage management of the ease of a vulnerability or a customer, set this up in Burp, get things ready to go, and actually show them how everything's set up, and do it easy and make it simple looking. But at the same time, once you have everything ready, you say, okay, just click here and either Burp on your browser after you've manipulated the packet. And just let them see how easy it is. And like that's sort of that visual type of thing is I've seen convince many people to realize that it's time to spend a little more money on security. So that's always a fun thing.
It gives you a show me. Remember many years ago when people were generating their own session tokens that weren't very random, Burp was a good way to show them that not only were the session tokens not very random, that you could change it and get somebody else's session. Now we don't do that anymore. But it was just a good way to show somebody, look, it's this easy, as you're saying. It
is, and it's like I think we would like to think that that's not that big a deal, but I think it sort of still is to a degree. I mean, we've got one of the states in the South. I'm going to forget which one it is. We covered this a few months ago, but a journalist at a school, he realized that the school's HR site, if you clicked view source, everything was there, like social security numbers, all sorts of information which shouldn't have been there. Someone was doing a select star and returning it in an array. But the governor of that state got highly offended and was trying to get the guy jailed for quote unquote hacking. This is table stakes, right? It's I think sometimes we forget, or a lot of people don't realize what's actually right underneath the surface of that coat of paint. So that's a pretty important point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Viewing source is not hacking.
Just need to get everyone to believe that. So, Lee, I think with that, we've wrapped up the news for this week. Again, I super appreciate you coming in here and helping out with this. It's been great to talk to you as always. Looking forward to seeing you in person soon again, pretty soon. It's been too long. And for all our listeners, also, thank you for listening and checking in with us. As always, we appreciate feedback and ideas. Please like and subscribe our videos and check out the links to our stories, which are in the show notes. Thanks again, Lee. If you're looking for some music for your next hacking session, I'd love to recommend to people Wolf Alice, just found her this weekend. And the band, I think they're really great music to listen to in the background. And with that, thank you, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you next time on Application Security Weekly.